Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our legislative webinar that is sponsored by the Department of Education. Our goal through this webinar is just to inform you of what's happening, so we appreciate our state partners, our legislators, their staffers, also our federal congressional delegation members and their staffers as well. We will try to keep this timely. We're just providing you with a high-level overview so that if you are asked, you can certainly answer those questions, but also to please know that any further guidance that you will need from this, we're happy to answer, and anytime beyond this, obviously we're accessible to all of you. There is an email that's scrolling at the bottom of your screen. It's the IDOE COVID-19. We are receiving a ton of questions via that email, but we will be monitoring that during this webinar. So if you have questions, please use that now, and then even past webinar time or at different times, you can continue to use that means to communicate. So our entire team will be monitoring and getting you the answers that you are needing. Right now, just to let you know that the department is very heavy in our communications, which we're going to talk about. We just wrapped up our last webinar. We hosted over 1,000 folks on that webinar. That's our 5th one in the series, just to make sure that our K-12 field and those partners are also being kept updated and making sure that language is very clarifying, as this is a difficult time. Also, to let you know that we've had some educators who have lost their lives due to COVID-19, and we also have some support staff and educators who are ill. That is impacting the services from some of our districts, anywhere from a teacher, athletic director, to food service, and which impacts food distribution. So the illness piece is catching up to all of us, but obviously our schools are being impacted in a variety of ways, including making a very difficult situation even worse, given that the illness is impacting now our personnel. So I wanted to share that, but on a positive note, I wanted to let you know that the department is obviously from the very beginning, the governor has taken control of this situation, and we appreciate his leadership in this. We have worked collaborative with his office, which is very refreshing. So we've had our hands in a lot of decision making, which I think is important during this time to listen to experts, and I commend them for doing so. But we also are very involved with the EOC, which is established from the governor's office. We are in those meetings and providing data updates at least twice a day. So I commend Steve Balco and his team are taking point to that from the department, but we're very involved. We provide information when it's needed. If we don't have an update for that time period, we certainly don't provide just to provide. We're trying to make sure it's timely, it's relevant, and it's something that's pressing that it gets to the EOC. So we commend that Emergency Operations Center for the work that they are doing. They've done an amazing job, and we appreciate being at the table. The department has retooled. The departments of ed across the nation are trying to figure out role and how to muddle through the situation. Here in Indiana, what we decided to do is, given it is a very, very different, and none of us have been through this, we bucketed it into 4 priorities, and we've announced this at press conferences, and the governor is aware. The first one being providing essential resources. We know our job is never to be top down, but to be that resource for providing guidance that is so critical, especially at times like now. So providing essential resources, bucket 1. Bucket 2 is providing academic support, knowing it's critical that we keep the academics and that continuous learning going the best we can. Engaging educators. We certainly don't want to lose educators at this point. We are very cognizant of the social, emotional, behavioral part for educators, very similar to anyone who's in the working field or struggling through this with families, but we also want to keep those educators engaged. We do feel like this is a good opportunity for some that have reached out, and through time that they have, how can we utilize that time for some professional development, which has been quite interesting, and providing guidance. So again, we're not being top down. We're trying to provide the guidance that is necessary so schools can operate in a way that is efficient and effective given where we're at right now. We do, as a department, all those 4 buckets are tied up, and all of them are dependent upon communications. So we have really pushed out our communications. It's always been strong with our comms team here at the department, but this is that on steroids. So right now we have retooled our COVID-19 resource website page that's getting a ton of traction. We have guiding documents. Our FAQ for a lot of our districts is the Bible right now. And so for those who, any updates, we're trying to be as clear and concise as possible in that FAQ. People are living on it literally, that we can see the activity. It's just very important right now. That FAQ is huge. It's open to the public. We obviously have nothing to hide, but anybody can see the FAQ. You are able to get on as well to see that. If you have trouble finding that FAQ, we can help you. If you use the email at the bottom to correspond with us, we can get you there. We also have a remote learning page where we really tooled up and had our resources that are there, that has been getting a ton of traction. Our academic team has done an amazing job linking remote learning resources. There are pieces to it that we've worked with our partners, we've worked with local districts, we've also done a lot of national connection and our homework on what that looks like to provide resources, but not to make it so overwhelming that it's irrelevant. And there's that careful balance. And we've had great feedback regarding those resources, especially from those districts that don't have huge tech teams or instructional coaches or tech integrationists. They are heavily relying on this, or they are new to e-learning. And so that has been an extremely important and great resource that Robin LeClaire and her team has led with. And again, the email at the bottom, we answer hundreds and hundreds of emails a day, and that has not slowed down. It's just different topics given the moment, but our turnaround time has been very quick on that. We're also doing our customer service survey to make sure that we are getting it right. So that's been a huge piece of, we are keeping a pulse on the field and keeping a pulse on ourselves. So that you know, we surveyed the field, and here's some information that we have been sharing. Right now, 64% of our districts are utilizing the USDA food program for food distribution. 91% of all of our districts and charter schools are offering something. So that doesn't mean the rest of the 9% aren't doing anything, but they're usually using a local food pantry, or there's not maybe a need. They were providing something and they weren't having traction given the socioeconomics of their area. But most of our districts are offering something. Given that we're about a month into this, we're running into a couple of issues, one being the distribution of food. If you can only distribute so many meals based on your district during a time period, the longevity of that food supply is getting interesting. Also, food service. We've had some schools that have reported that their food service folks are becoming ill, which adds a whole other level of complexity to the piece of food distribution. Our rural schools are in pretty good shape, which is a good thing to announce, given that some of that's very remote, that we're not hearing any concerns except for a few communities that have worked through their superintendent to signal to us that food pantries are running low. The food pantries, though, we've reached out to the EOC. They have been very responsive on our food pantries, but we're good with the food pantries in most of our areas as well, but our rural areas are in good shape. Our urban areas, on the other hand, that's getting interesting. So we've had a couple of our urban districts who are, they're in good shape, but some of them are struggling, looking at alternative means, trying to get some waivers from the feds, whether that's through something that looks similar to like an MRE for the military to have the longevity of the food supply and an easier way to deliver more of it at one time. Some of our districts are looking at that, looking at waivers for our food, but I think we're in pretty decent shape for the most part regarding food distribution and meals. Now, the longer this goes on, the financial impact to our families will also play into this. So we are aware of that, and also the health of our food service providers. We haven't had as much problem. Early on, we were concerned about supply from our food distributors. Right now, from what we're hearing is we're good right now. Early on, we were a little bit shaky, but right now I think we're good. Instructionally, just so you know, as of March 31st, we had a survey that we put out and got the results back. 95% of our districts or charter who we had very limited charter who actually participated in the survey, but of our folks who participated, 100% of our traditional districts and some of our charter, 95% reported back they were doing something with e-learning, whether it was packets or e-learning or a combination or a hybrid of such, but 95% of our districts are doing something. And we're going to know more what they're doing because our continuous learning plans, in order to be eligible for the waiver, are due April 17th. We will get those, review those, make sure we have some comments and get those back to districts, but many of them have a pretty good plan. Now, having said that, we are worried about the inequity of it. So if I'm a district that I was a superintendent at Yorktown, we'd been doing e-learning for a decade. Our kids had devices, our kids had access, and if they didn't, we were proactive early on in surveying those families to see how we could provide that. Our teachers were trained, our administrators knew expectations, and our families had buy-in. So it's very different from, we've never done this before and we're turning it around, and we don't have devices, we don't have internet access, our teachers aren't trained, but we have some districts that are muddling through that, so it looks very different. It's not perfect. But having said that, we know that that's not the only platform. We're using television programming. For instance, PBS has been a great partner with us for Indiana. We're using telephone. We're using just things that are at home that are good, practical lessons that we've created that we're pushing out. The paper packets have worked for many of our districts, but having said that, we have some families now that are very concerned about the tangible piece of that as far as the spread. So they don't want the tangible packets at home, and they certainly don't want, our schools sometimes don't want them to return it. So that's becoming interesting. So there is just nothing easy about this situation, but everybody at this point will turn in a continuous learning plan, and they're doing the best they can given the circumstance and their capacity. The tech plans were also due to us. 99% of the traditional public schools submitted, about 88% of our charters submitted, and our choice eligible schools are not required to submit, so I'm not real sure the tech situation, which I've heard, which is somewhat concerning. Some are further along than others, but the tech plan will provide us even more information on who needs what. We've had some great partners as far as internet access step up depending on where you live in the state of Indiana, and the providers that are accessible step up and say, hey, we can provide 2 months for free or 3 months for free or a very low discount for districts. Using E-rate, we've gotten really creative with that. But a lot of different things happening in the instructional world. Please know that everybody understands the concern with rigor, but on the flip side of that, we have heard from just as many families saying they want it all stopped, to be honest. So we have a real balance that we're playing here, of families saying we have one device in our household, we've got 3 children, we're trying to remote work, or we don't have employment at this time, and it's adding stressors that we cannot keep up with. So we've sent them back to their districts to work through that. But we know those are real. So to just think that everybody's going to be in an environment that every person in a family has a device, everybody can do it at their own pace, everybody has great internet access that's fast, and things are going smoothly is just not keeping a pulse on things. But everybody's doing the best they can given the situation. Do we have room for improvement? Absolutely. We are targeting those who need that support versus those who maybe don't need as much support. We're letting them do their thing, but we are targeting our supports because of capacity as well. The CARES Act, I'll give credit where credit's due. The USAID has been very good about acknowledging our waivers for food, assessment, accountability. We've had a lot of quick turnaround from the feds. One gentleman just called, and our team's calling him back about the CARES Act distribution. We are looking at in Indiana about $215 million. Obviously, that'll be distributed on a formula basis. It matters depending on size and poverty levels and a lot of complexities that go into that formula. We have distributions looking from anywhere from $840 for an academy to all the way to $22 million for IPS. So that span is huge. So when I hear people say, well, districts are good, they're going to have money, you have to remember we have some districts getting $12,000. That's not going to touch the issue here. But others who are getting $20 million, put it in all perspective, but that's very, very different from what some of our districts are getting as far as the CARES money relief. We are happy to get any amount of money, but because of the way it's formula distributed, we just want people to be very cautious and not to be overly optimistic that this is going to be a big game changer, because it's certainly not given the amount of money many of our districts in Indiana will receive. We have cautioned them about spending. This is not a time to get, a Gary to get a couple $1 million and go out and buy a bunch of iPads and not have a plan. So we are cautioning districts about their expenditure, about how that looks, what that looks like, the time frame. You have until 2022. Let's be smart about this. So that piece of CARES. We've also, under the Family First Act, as far as CARES goes, we've also signaled to schools that as far as being eligible for CARES, that they need to be very cautious, because it's clear that you need to keep the employment of the personnel going through this time, unless other than a financial hardship. If there's a really, really good reason besides financial hardship that you're not doing that, you will have to answer to that before you're eligible. Now, there have been some questions regarding if the governor's actions are aligned to the Family First Act. We are getting clarification. Some schools are pushing back to say that that's not. Others are saying it absolutely is. So we're going to have to get some further guidance regarding from the governor's office on their intent of their language as far as where we are during this pandemic and the shutdowns and the stay-at-home provisions, that type of thing, to get some provisions. But Family First, we understand the CARES. We are having people monitor that daily, so we are on top of that. Instructional days, just so you know, the EE, which is probably old news at this time, but we have districts that can either hit 160 days or 20 days of instruction between May 13th and June 30th. Why June 30th? June 30th statutorily marks the end of a school year. So the end of our school year of 1920 is actually June 30. Will districts usually go up to that point? No, but they have that provision to use that 20-day period. Many of them will finish way before the June 30th date. We're looking at bringing that submission in through our calendar report. Our calendar reports are due at the end of their calendar year, school year, to collect to see what districts are using 160 and what districts are using the 20-day provision. My concern is, reports look the way reports look. And I will say there are some districts that are going up to that 180 days and it looks solid. Other districts are saying 180 days and I'm concerned about the quality. So all of that quality plays into it. Districts are trying to get as much of the academic piece in as they possibly can, but they are weighing that balance of the pressure they're getting from families, the pressure they're getting from their students, the situation with the amount of training that their staff has had, their capacity with technology, all that's playing into this. But many of our districts are looking at least 160 days to at least hit that mark, but there are some hardships out there. So we will know what that is once we get our calendar reports. Instructional concerns, we are not alone in this. Indiana is looking at how do we best take care of our most vulnerable. Having been a special education teacher, I know the opportunity and the struggles that are associated with such a piece. Also, as a principal and superintendent, I know that e-learning piece with special education can be quite tricky. It's very doable, but it can also be quite tricky. The feds provided us guidance in late March, which we have shared with the field, about timelines for special ed evaluations, EL, 504, different types of guidance to help us hit those thresholds, honor our students with disability as far as honoring their needs and the timelines that they deserve and that are based in law, but also be cognizant of the situation. So how that looks may be different, but we're trying to make sure that our students are provided with the services that they deserve and that they are owed, and also make sure that the schools on their end were approaching it in a practical way, that we're not setting them up for the impossibility. So the special ed, EL, 504, also our students of poverty. Again, we are targeting those areas that we know they need immense support in e-learning. Honestly, some of them, as far as just device distribution, access, how does that look at home? How do you communicate this to families? How are those expectations set? How many minutes should be per content area? So we have created an e-learning document that, again, is getting a lot of traction for those who are new. We've taken a lot of emails and a lot of phone calls to help provide that and walk people through that. It is not easy. Having done that at the local level at a district of 2,500, it was tough. And so some of our districts are much larger than that, and that brings a whole other set of concerns with that. But we're trying to get through that poverty piece as well. We're also running up against the families of the newly unemployed that are signaling to schools as far as whatever services schools can do, they are taking advantage, whether it be food, telemedicine, teletherapy, anything that the schools can provide. As many of you know, our schools are the hub in many of our communities for stability, for routine, for getting to yes, and just making things happen. And so, and for our superintendents and for our principals and our teachers who have been really going beyond the call of duty per se, they've done amazing work. But the newly unemployed, we're starting to hear from those families that are becoming ill. We're also starting to have some different conversations with those families. That's been interesting as well, which ties into the whole social emotional behavior part. So there's the academic piece. There's also the social emotional behavior part of this for not just the students, but for families and educators and everyone involved. We have provided, again, a ton of resources. A lot of our teachers are at least having daily touches or weekly touches with students as far as a phone call, an email, a Zoom, a Microsoft Team, whatever it may be. They're having those communications. A lot of it may be through their learning management system, their LMS, but we are continuing to see great things happening from the district level. Robin, do you want to add to that? Anything you're seeing in SEL regarding the happiness class or any upticks that Robin LeClaire is our one of our chiefs in the academic arena, and I'm going to have her just share a couple things she's seeing with the SEL behavior piece.
The social emotional learning team has been working on some webinars, which many of your folks have been attending. And so we've had over 100 educators attend an SEL webinar on the happiness class for their own self-care, as we're encouraging teachers and educators to make sure they're taking care of themselves in this very important time and their families. Additionally, we've had a webinar with over 250 people that have attended on social emotional learning in the classroom and how they, from a remote learning environment, can still provide some of the social emotional learning. On the website that was referred to by Dr. McCormick earlier for educators to find resources, we have attached many things for teachers to use with their students and for families to use with their children that involve social emotional learning lessons. Things like resilience and persistence and motor sensory skills. Right now, those are very important to our students, and we want to make sure that we are focusing on those as well as focusing on the academics. On our weekly learning challenges, there are SEL skills in there for our students to practice that don't require internet, that are available for all of our students. So we're making sure that we're keeping a focus on that and trying to help educators do the same.
On the assessment part, we, as Indiana, many of you know, we've canceled the assessment for this year. So I learned dyslexia, I read 3, I step 10, but there are a lot of questions for what does this look like upon summer, if possible, and upon return. For instance, will our I read 3 students who were 3rd graders this year now have to take it next year as 4th graders for the first time? How will that look? You know, from the beginning, we have said as a department, we would love to see I Read 3 go away and roll into I Learn 3, which would be a cost savings, a time savings. There's so much potential with that, but we'd have to have the General Assembly give us some help with that. But this would be a great time to transition away from I Read 3 into just an I Learn 3 or I Learn 3 piece. So, but that's happening. We would need some help with that. Also, some clarification with I Step 10. Our team's trying to put some information together regarding our sophomores, for the most part, got through one portion, whether it was language arts or math, got by one portion. So for participation purposes, we could literally check the box for the feds and for graduation requirements, but they didn't complete the entirety of the exam. So what does that mean? Given that pathways are coming in and given that it's pathways are pretty heavy in bucket 3 and assessment, what exactly will that look like? So we have some questions that are coming up. We are also under, because the summer window and the winter retake window for some of those exams are so tight, and not knowing what our summer's going to look like as far as physically being present anywhere. There are just a lot of unknowns right now that we're thinking through and coming up with, if this scenario, then this, if this scenario, then this. And so, like many of the people across the nation that are trying to make decisions. SAT, ACT questions have been coming, and obviously, working with our schools that are communicating that out. AP, I will give College Board credit. They've done a great job with resources. They're offering AP tests to be taken at home. We'll see how many students opt in to do that. I'm assuming it's going to be high given what the credit bearing potential would be, but to be determined. So that you know what's on our radar here at the department, we always deal with the here and now, the current, which is pretty heavy, and then we have a short term, and that looks very different as this is a very fluid situation, and then the long term, including some reentry. So short term would be, a couple weeks out, and then we've got long term, summer school, fall, next school year in totality. What does this look like? And so people are trying to plan. It is a lot of unknowns. And then when we do get back to normal per se, what's that new normal look like? Because we know there are going to have to be some changes, and that's real. And we're also listening to the experts about the unknown of fall. If another round happens, another breakouts of COVID, or how there's just so many unknowns. But we are paying attention to that because we do know the skill gap, the credit issue is going to be real. So skill gaps, experts are telling us, depending on what's happening at the individual level or at the school level, if it's charter or non-pubs, what's happening with continuous learning, what's happening at home plays into this, but we're looking at anything potentially of a 30% learning loss in English language arts and a 50% learning loss in math, and that's what the experts are throwing out there. But there's a lot of variables in that, but we know there's going to be loss, we just don't know the significance. As a team, we're still doing our homework on that. And regardless of what that loss is, we know there's going to be some loss. And regardless of the credits that we're losing, we know there's going to be credit issues for really our middle school through current grade 11 that we're going to have to really do probably some catch up. Now, having said that, most districts are doing everything they can to keep that credit bearing coursework going and credit earning opportunities alive, so that we can keep that on track indicator going, but not everybody's in that situation. So again, it depends, but we know that that's real. We also we hear people talk about what the quality of that looks like. So if you're in your second semester of chemistry and you had 9 weeks left, and you're trying to relearn chemistry kind of on your own with some remote type of instruction or online instruction, that is just different. And so we know that plays into this as far as what that opportunity looks like and the quality. The CTE piece we've had a lot of questions about. As a reminder, based on the General Assembly, the CTE, the Career Tech Ed piece, went to the Governor's Workforce Cabinet, so we have been sending questions over there. We know there's a ton of questions upon re-entry, upon the new norm. What happens to work-based learning? What happens to internships and externships? What happens to courses like health professionals? And the list goes on, and I think the Governor's Workforce Cabinet is going to have a lot to consider. People are wanting some guidance like yesterday, and we know that that's very fluid, but again, that will be housed at the Governor's Workforce Cabinet, and a lot of those decisions will land there as far as that practical guidance that is needed by schools. Fiscally, just so that all of you know, the current appropriations for our summer school are $18.3 million. The current request for this coming summer, due June 1, this summer I'm assuming will be heavy and online, which again goes back to the inequity piece, who has access, who doesn't, so we're trying to work through that. We are estimating at least a $28 million ask, which is $10 million beyond our current appropriations. Last year we were at $22 million, and we think that's going to be more, so I think that $28 million may be shooting low, but given that some of our schools have signaled that their families are signaling just give it a rest, reduce those stressors, they're looking at that pretty strategically and prioritizing. We have the other issue of material collection from our district. So some of you I know have contacted us to say families are wanting to get into the school to get their materials. There are logistical issues with that, safety issues with that. We have worked with our local schools to do what we can. If someone absolutely needs something in the school, we have worked that out. But we're trying to be real smart with as far as entry into a school building right now based on a total essential need. Just because you want something that you may not need, that's not a priority. But if there is something you need to get your hands on and there's a really good reason why, certainly material collection has become an issue. Professional development for educators, I mentioned most of the departments, summer has been turned into online. Anytime you do that, from our experience, you see those numbers drop. But we're going to offer those, and we'll look what fall's going to bring as far as opportunities, and we'll go from there. We know that we'll need professional development for nurses, for custodial staff, for cleaning. There are a lot of pieces to that for bus drivers, that the new norm is going to look different. So what does that look like in the fall? We are keeping track of all that and starting to bring groups together as far as collecting of names and having conversation of what do they think this looks like from the practical lens. Obviously, pulling in the health department when that time comes will be extremely important at the state level to help us make some decisions. That reentry piece is going to look very different in some respects for Marion County versus like a Henry County, and that is realistic, and taking all that in consideration is another piece. Whether we stagger, it's holistic. What does that look like? How does that feel? Grade level roll-ins. I've heard all kinds of different ideas, but we are starting those conversations and keeping our master list of things that will need to be addressed. Fall 2020. Again, keeping a list of those reentry concerns. That is a long-term in theory, but really the conversations have already started. What I don't appreciate is people who want the answer yesterday, because this is so fluid that the health folks don't even have the answers today that we need for 2 months down the road. So in all fairness, we're trying to be as inclusive as we can on our thoughts and being very purposeful and having a really good plan. It's not going to be perfect right now just because there's so many unknowns, but at least the conversations are happening, and you need to know that we're keeping it on our radar. Anything legislatively that we would need help with, we will certainly communicate that to the governor's office. He's been great about EO or executive orders. And again, anything from the federal level, I have to say, we have had great response when credit's due from the U.S. Ed as far as our waivers have been super timely, and they've been great about keeping us informed on care. So that's good. We've not always had that response, so this has been great. Reversion money, just so you know, we were tasked at the department, given the revenue is going to be of question. We needed to really sharpen our pencils and get to business on a budget. And so for reversion monies per se, we don't have very many pencils, but per se, for reversion purposes, we're looking at around $37.7 million that we've been working with the budget agency. A lot of that is tuition support, but at this time, 37 million is 37 million. So that money, I know from the state level, is going to be tough. I know the surplus people have really started beating down on questions as far as from our end, where we've communicated that's not our authority to dip into anything. But for reversions, we've been good partners and reverted back what we could. We will be reverting that back at the end of the June 30th. So I commend our finance team for working with the budget agency as well to get that taken care of. So with that, you have an email at the bottom of the screen. I'm not sure we've had any questions, so I think we haven't had questions at this point. We are accessible. Again, we appreciate your attendance. We are happy to answer any questions that you may have. Just know that your Department of Education is working hard to support the field, support our students, families, and educators. But in addition, really across agencies has been pretty strong, and we're very pleased with that collaborative type of nature going between the governor's office and the Department of Education. Very welcomed, and when you see that, you get things done. So we've appreciated that partnership. So with that, if there are no questions, we will await anything that you may have to add or ask at a different time. And for our federal partners, thank you for what you're doing. Again, it's been super helpful to have good friends from Indiana and in DC. Thank you.